All right, we're going to talk about Chapter 15, Contracts in Writing. Some contracts have to be in writing. Most contracts do not. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the two types of contracts. So let's discuss what we're going to cover in this chapter. So we'll talk about the statute of frauds, which means those contracts that need to be in writing. So we'll talk about those contracts that fall within the statute of frauds. We'll talk about compliance with the statute of frauds. We'll also talk about the effect of non-compliance. Then we'll talk about the parole evidence rule. We'll talk about what the rule actually is. We'll talk about situations to which the rule does not apply. And then we'll talk about the concept of supplemental evidence. And then we'll actually finish off the chapter by talking about interpretation of contracts, which is really a very, very broad term that means a lot of different things. So let's start off talking about the statute of frauds. Which contracts fall within the statute of frauds? Well, the rule is that contracts within the statute of frauds must be evidenced by a writing to be enforceable. So in other words, if a contract falls within the statute of frauds, then if it is not in writing, it cannot be enforceable. So the contract must be in writing. What about electronic records? Well, full effect is given to electronic contracts and signatures. We're starting to see a lot more of that, in particular in real estate transactions. We're starting to see now that people sign acceptances or provide offers, and even contracts, even completed real estate contracts are done with electronic signatures. So electronic contracts and electronic signatures are just as valid as if you had signed it in person or using ink. What about a suretyship provision? Well, it applies to promises to pay the debts of others. In other words, it almost serves like insurance. That's why we call it suretyship. So in other words, if I owe you a debt, let's say I owe you $100,000. But I don't have the money. So my mom says, you know what, I'll pay the $100,000 on his behalf. Well, that would be a suretyship provision in a contract. Now the promise must be collateral. And what that means is that promisor, remember the promisor is the person making the promise, must be secondarily, not primarily liable. So in other words, if I promise to pay you the money, that person has to be almost a guarantor. So in my example, the debt is between me and you. I'm the one that's primarily liable, but my mom agrees to pay my debt, and so then she's the promisor, right? She promises to pay my debt, so she's secondarily liable, not primarily, right? So the obligation is mine. There's also something called the main purpose doctrine. Remember, we're talking about the statute of frauds. So in other words, a suretyship provision, or if there is a promise to pay the debt of a third person, then that contract needs to be in writing. And so that's the purpose of all of this, and that's what this means. Same thing with the main purpose doctrine. If the primary objective is to provide an economic benefit to the surety, then the promise is not within the statute. In other words, it does not need to be in writing. That's what not being within the statute means. If a document or a promise or an obligation is within the statute, then it requires that promise or that contract to be in writing. If it's not within the statute, or if it's outside the statute, then it does not have to be in writing. So that's what this slide is basically saying, that if the main purpose or if the primary objective is to provide an economic benefit to the surety, not just an obligation to pay. For example, in my example, where my mom agreed to pay my debt. Well, my mom is not receiving any economic benefit from that. She's just agreeing to pay my debt. So in that case, it has to be in writing. But now if my mom is receiving some economic benefit, meaning, let's say I tell my mom, I say, look, I don't have $100,000 to pay, but if you pay the $100,000 for me, I'll pay you, I'll give you back the 100,000 and I'll pay you an additional 20,000. So then now, really, I guess even in my example, it's not a good example, right? Because the key is that the primary object has to be to provide an economic benefit to the surety. So here in my example, even if I pay my mom 20,000, still the primary object is to provide, or the primary object is to pay my debt, right? So it's not for my mom to receive any economic benefit. So that contract would still need to be in writing. So it's only when the surety or the person that's agreed to pay the other person's debt receives an economic benefit, then that contract is outside of the statute of frauds and does not need to be in writing. And I can't think of a good example of that right now as I sit here. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here for now.